So we're getting closer and closer to the NBA trade deadline, which means it's time for some predictions. What do I think is going to happen at the deadline? What actual moves do I think will or will not happen this year? First and foremost is something that I'm very confident in. I think Dejounte Murray is going to be an LA Laker by the time the trade deadline is over. And in addition to that, I would be shocked if D'Angelo Russell is still on the Lakers roster post-trade deadline. Now, granted, I probably would have made that prediction about D'Angelo Russell even back in the offseason because it was clear when they signed him to the contract that they gave him a little bit too much money, but it was a very tradable contract for a deal just like this Dejounte Murray one. And moving on from D'Lo kind of always made sense. He was always going to be a little bit of a stepping stone to something bigger potentially for the Lakers. And the Murray stuff, there's just way too many rumors. There's a structure that makes way too much sense for both teams right now. And the real hurdle appears to be, Atlanta doesn't want D'Angelo Russell, so they have to find a third team for D'Lo to go to and give Atlanta a different expiring contract. But D'Angelo Russell and a first in exchange for Dejounte Murray, plus maybe something else, Rui Hachimura otherwise, makes a ton of sense for both teams and is a deal that I fully expect to happen. Only reason that this wouldn't happen, one, the concept of Dejounte Murray getting traded in general, and two, him going to the Lakers, is if, for whatever reason, some other target becomes available for the Lakers that they like better, or Dejounte Murray's been playing pretty well for Atlanta, so maybe they want to hang on to him, or maybe they get super weird and decide to potentially move on from Trae Young at the deadline, which would be a shock. But those are really the only scenarios in which I see this not happening. I think absolutely Dejounte Murray is going to get moved. I think the Lakers are the most likely landing spot, and I would almost guarantee that D'Angelo Russell is not going to be an LA Laker once the trade deadline is over. Next up now is a team that, for whatever reason, trade-wise, people just aren't really talking about, and it's the Philadelphia 76ers. My official prediction for Philly here is they are getting someone. They are making some kind of a move. There's no way that they go past the trade deadline and not cash in on some of the assets that they got in the James Harden trade. With how incredible of a Joel Embiid season that they're getting, with how good Tyrese Maxey has been, they're going to do, whether it be Tobias Harris and some stuff for someone to replace Tobias Harris. I thought they were an interesting Siakam team before Siakam went to Indiana. They're going to get somebody. My best guess right now is that maybe they would be in on Zach Lavine because it wouldn't require a ton and they could still have some assets for the offseason while helping out their team this year and making some kind of a move. But for the most part, this is just, it feels like a Philly team that is right there amongst the contenders in the Eastern Conference and has the ability to add pieces. And their whole goal every year now, when Embiid is as good as he is you go and try and win the title. And as good as their roster is right now, it's clear that they can upgrade around Maxey and around Embiid. And that was part of the reason why they took the Harden trade when they did and why they took what they did in exchange for Harden to try and get some extra pieces. It's hard right now to find exactly who the player would be in Philadelphia, but right now I'm expecting Zach Lavine to potentially be an option for them with a handful of other guys being involved in as well. But I definitely think Philly is adding somebody significant at the deadline. Speaking of Zach Lavine, I would be very surprised if he is still a member of the Chicago Bulls after the deadline. There's just too many rumors about whether it be Detroit or San Antonio or Philadelphia or the Lakers. There's just too many rumors out there, and it makes too much sense for this Bulls front office to finally move on from Lavine and potentially some other pieces on the roster as well. They've played really well without Lavine on the floor, and I think obviously the biggest hurdle here is going to be finding a team that actually wants to give up something of relative value in exchange for Lavine. That's going to be difficult to find given his contract and some of the injury stuff, but even if it is just for expirings and like a little bit of extra value, I think that's a trade worth doing for Chicago because I don't think that his value is going to increase at any point into the future all the way until like his contract expires basically. So it just makes too much sense. Now granted, this is a Bulls front office that like doesn't really make trades and appears to kind of have a little bit of that Masai Ujiri kind of vibe going on where it's like they are always asking for way too much in exchange for their guys. So that's definitely a concern in terms of actually making this prediction saying that Lavine will 100% be on another team. But I still think that's the direction we're going, as I mentioned in the earlier section, Philadelphia and a handful of other teams. But what about some guys that I think are going to stay? Guys that will not be traded. First and foremost, I think Trae Young is still going to be on the Atlanta Hawks. There's some weird rumors and stuff around that situation. Trae's currently hurt and not able to play as a concussion. There's some stuff there, but I would be surprised if they pulled the trigger on that kind of a move, even though I think from a basketball perspective, you certainly can make the case that it would make sense for them and then there would be teams that would be willing to give up some stuff for Trae. If they are to make that move, I would expect it to be more so in the offseason or maybe the following year. I don't think they're quite at the point of actually moving on from Trae Young, so I think Trae stays. I think Lauri Markkanen stays in Utah. He's someone that in the beginning of the year, it seemed like they were exploring trading because their team just wasn't very good, and lately they've been much, much better and are probably a play-in team in the Western Conference, or at least in contention for a play-in spot in the West, and I don't expect them to move on from Markkanen, partially because they would ask for a lot because he's very, very good, but also just because it doesn't really make a ton of sense with their current roster being actually pretty decent to then continue to break it down even more with an upcoming draft class that isn't looking that strong in the first place. There's no real incentive for them to tank their way into the top 5 of the draft odds, and Lauri Markkanen's very good. So unless someone like Oklahoma City comes out of nowhere with a 6 or 7 first-round pick offer in exchange for Lauri Markkanen, I think he is definitely going to stay in Utah, despite a little bit of buzz there in the beginning of the year. And then also Donovan Mitchell. For a while, I thought it was pretty inevitable that at the deadline or in the offseason, Donovan Mitchell was going to be on a new team. But since Evan Mobley and Darius Garland got hurt, they've actually been pretty decent. And we've kind of gotten no rumors whatsoever about Cleveland having plans to trade him. Clearly, they're going to wait for their guys to get healthy and see how they do in the postseason this year. If they once again lose in the first round of the playoffs and then they go into next year with Donovan Mitchell with 1 year left on his deal, I think at that point, things get much, much more concerning. But we're probably a year ahead on the timeline in terms of a possible Donovan Mitchell trade. Unless something crazy happens, which is always able to happen at the deadline, I think Donovan Mitchell is going to stay. And then the last team to talk about here is the Brooklyn Nets. And this is the team that I have a hard time getting a read on exactly what I think is going to happen, because one of two directions is where they're going to go. Either they're going to start trading away, Dorian Finney-Smith, Royce O'Neal, some of these older wings, role player wings on their team that a lot of teams around the league would really, really like to have and desperately have a need for those kinds of players. Or they're potentially going to be a team involved in getting Zach Lavine, Dejounte Murray. This team desperately needs a guard, and it wouldn't be difficult for them to upgrade at that spot, either from an asset perspective for Lavine or Murray, or just in general because their guards are so terrible. I think right now, the idea of them adding, Dejounte Murray, Zach Lavine in the backcourt seems less likely. It seems like there's rumors out there about that, but I almost wonder if there's a reason that those rumors are out there so that they, kind of confuse teams a little bit. I think it's much more likely that Finney-Smith is on a new team, Royce O'Neal is on a new team, and Spencer Dinwiddie, all 3 of those guys are on a new team, and the Nets get some kind of assets in exchange. They have been, over the last 25 games, one of the worst teams in the league. If you look at their record over the last 21 to 25 games, they have basically the same record as Detroit, Washington, and San Antonio in the last 25 games. They have been terrible, and there's no way that they can look at this roster and think that they are a Dejounte Murray away from being a playoff team. They're just not, and they have too many good players and assets that other teams would like to have from a veteran role player perspective for them to not make a move. So even though there is some smoke out there about them adding someone like Dejounte Murray, I think it's much more likely that whether it be Dinwiddie 100% not being on the team, and then Royce O'Neal and Finney-Smith, either one or both of those guys not being on the team post-trade deadline, and all of those players minus Dinwiddie are valuable and I think will potentially play into the championship chase depending on what teams they end up on. And those are my predictions for right now. Maybe I'll change those, over the next week or so. If there's some more rumors, maybe I'll come out with another one of these videos, but I always like to kind of put my stamp on a couple of things every deadline, every free agency, every offseason of things that I think are going to happen. And for me, Dejounte Murray getting traded, mostly the idea being to the Lakers, the Sixers adding somebody in general, somebody significant, a couple of those guys staying that I mentioned, like Trae Young, Lauri Markkanen, and Donovan Mitchell. And then I'm missing one here. Oh, just Zach Lavine not being on the Chicago Bulls, and then all the net stuff that I mentioned. Those are my things I feel very confident in predictions for the 2024 NBA trade deadline.